They blamed me for the leak I never made 2 years ago. I was escorted out of a tech company by 2 security guards while 40 of my coworkers watched, because leadership believed I had leaked our biggest unreleased product to a competitor 3 weeks before launch. I hadn't leaked anything. I didn't even have access to the files they said I'd sent. It took me 14 months to prove that. And when I finally did, the truth wasn't about a leak at all. It was about a man who needed someone to blame before anyone looked too closely at what he'd actually been doing. This is that story chapter one. My name is Nadia Akhafer. 3 years ago, I was a senior product manager at a mid-sized tech company called Veriloom, based in Austin. We built workplace scheduling software, the kind of unglamorous but genuinely useful product that quietly runs behind a lot of companies you've heard of. I'd been at Veriloom for 4 years by that point, working my way up from a junior product analyst to owning one of our 3 core product lines. My direct manager was the vice president of product, a man named Julian Ashworth. Julian had joined Veriloom from a much larger, flashier tech company 18 months earlier, brought in specifically to modernize our product roadmap, and everyone assumed eventually take over as chief product officer when our current CPO retired. Julian was charming in meetings, confident, the kind of person who always had a compelling story ready for investors and board members. Underneath that, though, something felt slightly hollow to me in a way I couldn't quite articulate for a long time. He talked a lot about vision. He talked less about execution, which, as any product person will tell you, is where the actual work happens. For the first year working under Julian, things were fine. I led development on what would become our biggest product launch in company history, an AI-assisted scheduling tool called Flowpath, designed to automatically resolve scheduling conflicts across large organizations using predictive modeling. It was ambitious. It took 11 months to build. And it was, without exaggeration, the most important thing our company had ever shipped. Julian presented Flowpath to the board as his vision. I didn't love that, but I'd made peace with it, the way a lot of people in corporate structures make peace with credit flowing upward. What mattered to me was that the product was good, and that it would actually help the customers who used it. 3 weeks before our planned public launch, everything fell apart. If you've ever built something incredible and watched someone else's name get attached to it in every room that mattered, comment below. This story is about to show you exactly how far that kind of arrangement can go wrong. Chapter TWOA rival company, much larger than us, called Sterling Workflow, announced a new product feature that was, in almost every meaningful way, identical to Flowpath. Same predictive conflict resolution model, same visual interface concepts, even strikingly similar language in their press release describing the technology. Veriloom's leadership team went into crisis mode immediately. Our CEO, a man named Robert Danvers, called an emergency meeting with the full product and engineering leadership. "Someone leaked this," Robert said, packing at the front of the conference room. "There's no other explanation. Sterling didn't reverse engineer 11 months of development in 3 weeks." I agreed with him, honestly. It did look like a leak. I just never imagined it would be pointed at me. Julian spoke up almost immediately. "I want to be transparent with everyone here. I've had some concerns about access controls on the Flowpath project files for a while now. I raised this internally a few months ago." He glanced toward IT's representative in the room. "I think we need a full audit of who's had file access, especially anyone who's had recent contact with Sterling employees." I remember sitting there, nodding along, agreeing this made sense, having no idea he was building a case that would end with my name at the center of it. The audit found that I had, in fact, exchanged messages on LinkedIn with a former colleague who now worked at Sterling, a woman named Priyanka Mehta, someone I'd worked with years earlier at a completely different company, who occasionally reached out about industry events or general career catch-ups. Nothing about Flowpath, nothing remotely confidential. Just the kind of ordinary professional networking most people in tech maintain across companies. But Julian presented it differently. Chapter break here, because this is the exact moment things tipped. A completely normal professional relationship became, in the wrong hands, the foundation of an accusation. Keep that in mind as we go, because it matters a lot later. Chapter THREI was called into HR on a Thursday morning. Robert was there. Julian was there. A lawyer from our legal department was there too, which told me immediately how serious this had become. Nadia, Robert said, we've identified some concerning communication patterns between you and an employee at Sterling Workflow, occurring during the exact window our flow path specifications appear to have been compromised. Talked to Priyanka a handful of times over the last year, I said. We used to work together. I never discussed FlowPath with her. I never sent her anything. You explain why file access logs show your credentials accessing the complete FlowPath technical specification document 8 times in the 2 weeks before the Sterling announcement, the lawyer asked. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I accessed those documents because I was the product manager leading FlowPath. That was my job. I was in those documents constantly, for 11 months, because I was building the product. The access spike specifically in that 2-week window is unusual, Julian said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. I hate to say this, Nadia, but I noticed it too before the board asked for an audit. I looked at him. Julian, who I'd worked alongside for a year and a half, who I'd built the most important product in company history for, sat there presenting a timeline that made me sound like exactly what I wasn't. Julian, I was in those files constantly. I was finalizing the launch documentation during that exact window. I know that's your explanation, Julian said. I just think it's important the investigation looks at everything objectively. I was suspended that afternoon, pending a full investigation. 2 weeks later, I was terminated, officially for policy violations related to confidential information handling. Though everyone in that building understood what it actually meant, whether or not anyone said the word leak out loud in writing. If you've ever had your normal everyday work turned into evidence against you by someone who needed a distraction from something else, comment below. Because that's exactly what was happening here, and I didn't figure out the real reason for months chapter 4 getting fired for something that sounds like corporate espionage is a different kind of unemployment than getting fired for underperformance. Nobody in the industry wanted to touch me. Recruiters who'd reached out to me eagerly a year earlier suddenly stopped responding entirely. I later learned Veriloom's legal team had sent a carefully worded but unmistakably damaging note to at least 2 companies that called for references. I spent almost a year doing freelance product consulting for small startups, rebuilding slowly, quietly, while trying to understand how my normal work had been twisted into something that ended my career at a company I'd given 4 years to. The turning point came almost by accident. I stayed loosely in touch with a few former Veriloom coworkers, mostly through occasional messages, careful not to put anyone in an awkward position. One of them, an engineer named Desmond Wu who'd worked closely on the FlowPath backend, reached out to me 9 months after I'd been fired. Nadia, I need to tell you something, and I've been sitting on it for a while because I was scared about what it would mean for my own job. But I can't keep sitting on it. Desmond told me that a few months after I left, Veriloom's finance department had flagged unusual trading activity connected to Julian Ashworth. Veriloom was privately held at the time, but Julian, it turned out, held a significant personal stake in Sterling Workflow through a family trust connected to his wife's brother, who sat on Sterling's board. There's a rumor going around, Desmond said, that Julian had been quietly advising Sterling on product strategy for months before the FlowPath leak happened. Nobody said it directly, but people are starting to connect it. I sat with that information for a long time, second twist, right on schedule. If you're enjoying this story, tap subscribe now, because what I found next changed absolutely everything. Chapter FIVEI hired an employment attorney, a sharp, methodical woman named Renata Cole, who specialized in wrongful termination cases involving tech companies. I laid out everything Desmond had told me, along with my own timeline of events. This is a very different case than a simple wrongful termination, Renata told me. If what your former colleague is describing is accurate, we're potentially looking at a situation where you were terminated specifically to divert attention away from an executive's undisclosed conflict of interest. We filed a formal legal request for discovery, part of a wrongful termination lawsuit against Veriloom. It took months of legal back and forth, but eventually, through the discovery process, internal communications started surfacing that painted a very different picture than the one presented to me in that HR meeting over a year earlier. Emails between Julian and his brother-in-law dated months before the FlowPath leak, discussing product direction opportunities in vague but suggestive language. A personal financial disclosure form Julian had filed with Veriloom's compliance department when he joined. The same standard form every executive fills out, that conveniently omitted his family's financial connection to Sterling Workflow entirely. And most damning of all, a set of file access logs, the same category of evidence originally used against me, showing that Julian's own credentials had accessed the complete flowpath specification document 11 times during that same 2-week window, including twice from an IP address later traced to a hotel near Sterling Workflow's headquarters. During a period, Julian had told the company he was on a personal vacation. Nobody had ever cross-referenced his access logs against mine because nobody had ever thought to look. If you saw this coming, tell me in the comments. And if you didn't, we're not even at the confrontation yet. Stick around, because this is the part everyone who's messaged me about this story wants to hear. Chapter SIX, Renata, brought the full discovery findings to Veriloom's legal team, along with a clear message. Settle this case fairly, or the evidence would become part of a public court, filing that Veriloom's board, investors, and the broader tech press would all eventually see. Veriloom's board, understandably alarmed, launched their own internal investigation, separate from my lawsuit, specifically into Julian's financial disclosures and his activity during the weeks surrounding the leak. I wasn't in the room for what happened next, but Desmond, who still worked there, kept me updated as things unfolded internally. Julian was placed on administrative leave within a week of the board's investigation opening. 2 weeks later, forensic accountants confirmed the undisclosed financial relationship with Sterling Workflow. Combined with the access log evidence, showing Julian's own credentials in the flowpath files far more extensively than mine had ever been during the relevant window, the picture became difficult to argue with. Julian was terminated. Not quietly, either. Veriloom's board, once burned by how quietly the original situation had been handled, made sure this termination went through full legal review, on the record this time. Sterling Workflow, facing its own scrutiny once the connection became public through my lawsuit's filings, quietly pulled the competing feature from their product roadmap and issued a brief statement about reevaluating third-party consulting relationships, which was about as close to an admission as a company like that was ever going to make publicly. This is the part of the story that still sits with me the most, honestly. Not the vindication exactly, though that mattered. It's the fact that the exact evidence used to destroy my reputation, file access logs, turned out to be the same category of evidence that exposed the person who actually did it. Sometimes the truth really is just sitting there, waiting for someone to look in the right direction. If that resonates with you, drop a comment. I want to know if you've had a moment like that. 7Me lawsuit against Veriloom settled roughly 2 months after Julian's termination became public. I can't disclose the specific financial terms, but I can tell you it was substantial enough to fully cover the 1.5 years of lost income and reputational damage I'd experienced, along with a formal, written acknowledgement from Veriloom that the original investigation into my termination had been incomplete and improperly conducted. Robert Danvers, Veriloom's CEO, called me personally after the settlement was finalized. I almost didn't take the call. "Nadia, I owe you an apology, a real one, not a legal formality," he said. I trusted Julian's framing of that situation without pushing hard enough on the actual evidence. I let a talented person walk out of this building under false accusations, and I'm sorry for the role I played in that. I appreciated him saying it. It didn't undo the 14 months, but it mattered, hearing it directly, without lawyers shaping every word. "Like to ask you something, and I understand if the answer is no," Robert continued. "Would you be open to coming back? Not to your old role. I'd want you leading the entire product organization directly, reporting to me. We need someone who's proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly the kind of integrity this company needs at that level. If you were me, would you go back to the company that let this happen to you in the first place, even with a real apology on the table? I go back and forth on this one more than almost anything else in this story. Comment below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know what you'd do. Chapter EIGHTI did go back, eventually, though not right away. I took almost 3 months to think it over, consulting with people I trusted, including Renata, who reminded me that returning on my own terms, with a formal written apology and a leadership role that came with real authority, was a very different situation than the one I'd left. I've been leading Veriloom's entire product organization for almost a year now. Desmond still works with me, on the engineering side. A few months into my return, I made sure our internal investigation processes were rebuilt entirely, with clear protections against exactly the kind of situation that happened to me. Because file access logs, it turns out, tell a very different story depending on who's willing to actually read all of them, not just the ones that fit a convenient narrative. I think about that HR meeting a lot. Sitting across from people I trusted, watching normal, ordinary work get twisted into evidence against me by someone who needed a distraction from what he'd actually done. It's a specific kind of disorientation, having your own competence used as the weapon against you. But here's what I've come to believe, sitting on the other side of it now. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone powerful needs it to. It just waits, sometimes longer than feels fair, for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. If you're going through something like this right now, blamed for something you didn't do, watching the story being told about you diverge completely from what actually happened, I want you to know that the evidence that clears you is very often still out there. It just takes someone, sometimes you, sometimes someone else entirely, willing to keep looking. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe because I've got a lot more coming every week. And tell me honestly, would you have gone back to Veriloom or walked away for good, even with the apology? I read every single comment. See you in the next one.